Good evening, Darklings. Tonight, we revisit one of the most infamous encounters in Sasquatch history with executive producer Seth Breedlove and director Eli Watson of Small Town Monsters, the team behind the upcoming documentary, The Siege of Ape Canyon. 1924, Mount St. Helens, a group of miners isolated in the woods of Washington state stumble upon something they never were meant to see. That night, their isolated cabin became a battleground as a monstrous being laid siege upon them, hurling rocks, shaking the walls, and howling into the darkness. Over a century later, the story still grips us. Was it hysteria? Perhaps a hoax? Who or what attacked these men? We cover that next, right here on the very best in paranormal talk radio. I'm Dave Schrader, and this is my Paranormal 60.
I'm not gonna stand here and listen to this baloney.
He won't float. He doesn't stand for baloney.
Sounds like a lot of supernatural baloney to me.
Supernatural, perhaps. Baloney, perhaps not.
Good evening, friends. Thank you so much for joining us here again tonight. Exciting stuff going on. A lot of great guests are coming up, and I hope that you've been tuning in and checking out the Paranormal 360 on WCCO Radio. It's live Sunday nights. All you have to do is ask your smart device to launch WCCO Radio or set an alarm for every Sunday night from 7 to 9 p.m. Central to stream WCCO, and you'll be able to pick up the show, or just go look wherever you stream your favorite podcasts for Paranormal 360. That's Paranormal 360, and you'll be able to keep up with that show. Tonight, we've got an interesting and fascinating topic. Obviously, I love when we can get into the realm of cryptids. And for the longest time, most people really kind of picked up on cryptids right after 1967, right after the famous Patterson-Gimlin film. Well, at least that's when it really kind of gained some steam in the global consciousness. Now, what I think is fascinating is how many amazing stories exist out there that are even more compelling with more witnesses, but are less known. So tonight we've got two gentlemen joining us to help out with this. First of all, we've got Seth Breedlove. Seth, it's great to see you again. Thank you for being here this evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dave.
You got it. And joining us also, director Eli Watson. Eli, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
You got it. Now, this is a fascinating story, right? And I'm always curious, why do you think that stories like, the Sierra Sounds, the Patterson-Gimlin film, things like that gain such worldwide recognition and understanding, but then you have stories where there are so many more witnesses and so much more evidence that goes back even further that a lot of people are left unaware. Seth, what's your take on that?
I mean, this one got picked up by so many documentaries, especially in like the 70s when the subject was just coming to prominence. I mean, Eli will probably have a different take on this, but my opinion would just be that pop culture latched onto it so early on in like the burgeoning phase of Sasquatchery where this stuff was really just coming into the public eye. And for some reason, the Fred Beck story, the Ape Canyon story, it's also like, it doesn't get any cooler than like Bigfoot's attacking this cabin with rocks and like trying to kill people. That aspect of it alone kind of sets it apart from a lot of the other Bigfoot stories we know. But I just think pop culture really latched onto it early on. And, Mysterious Monsters covered it, Bigfoot Man or Beast covered it, like all the stuff that informed so many of the early researchers. It's also, if you're talking about early researchers, John Green talked about it a lot. Renee DeHinden talked about it. Every book ever written about Bigfoot has some sort of reference to Ape Canyon in it. So,
but it doesn't have the same kind of, at least maybe to the lay individuals, it doesn't seem to have the same kind of attention that a few other stories have garnered. And Eli, what do you think is the reason behind that? Obviously, it's been covered, it's been written about, but even talking about the fact I was going to have you guys on tonight to talk about this, I have some friends that are very much into different elements of the paranormal and cryptids, and this was a story they were unfamiliar with.
Well, I think the biggest thing especially now we're at 101 years after the event. I think just because it's so old is, it's kind of faded into obscurity. And even the documentaries Seth is talking about, I think the newer generation of people getting into this stuff are unfamiliar with some of those 1970s documentaries. You got to think that's 50 years ago. And then with, not to toot our own horn, the small town monster stuff is a little bit better. So, and, we haven't talked about it as much. So Seth did in the first On the Trail of Bigfoot, but I think since then it hasn't really been talked about in depth.
Right. And there are these waves of kind of nostalgia that go along with these different elements of strange stories, right? Where it seems like ghosts are all the rage for a while, then it kind of tamps down, and then it's cryptids, and then it tamps down, and then UAPs and UFOs. And it's nice that there are organizations and groups like Small Town Monsters that can continually bring these stories back up and give them a fresh light and perspective. Now, I do want to make a mention up front, too, because we are talking about the upcoming documentary. It is the Siege of Ape Canyon. And you guys also have a Kickstarter campaign that's going on that's launched on, I think it was the 6th of February. And tell people a little bit about the Kickstarter campaign. And I think they get an earlier access to see this documentary if they become part of it. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, distribution, you're well aware of this, Dave, but distribution with film is such a train wreck right now that when we started out doing this, backers would get access to movies like 2 weeks before the final release. At this point, there are movies we have given to backers back in November that we still don't have a release date for in 2025. So yeah, the early release thing has gotten to the point where it's like half a year or more with some of these titles. So that's probably it. It's probably the biggest selling point of the campaign, but yeah, this will be our 12th Kickstarter. So we've done a campaign pretty much every year that funds everything. It's weird because it's the 11th or 12th, but this is our 10-year anniversary, strangely enough. But this year we're kind of celebrating everything that led up to the 10-year anniversary. So we're bringing in a lot of the older titles like Minerva Monster, and there's like a Minerva Monster t-shirt that's part of the campaign and stuff like that. So this is not how, but it's a big part of funding everything we do throughout the year. And there's a book that like takes people through the previous 10 years of STM and all that kind of stuff. So it's probably our biggest campaign I think we've run. I think that's safe. That's a safe bet, but it's also, I mean, when you integrate something like Ape Canyon, which we've been asked to do, we've been asked to cover Ape Canyon since the first year of STM. I think it just elevates the whole thing to another level, and I'm pumped just to have the opportunity to see what Eli did with Ape Canyon, because, it's probably my favorite Bigfoot story next to the Minerva one. And so to have it, be such a key role in the Kickstarter this year, that's exciting for me.
And for listeners or viewers, you'll notice on the program guide for today, we have a link to Small Town Monsters, and we have a link to their Kickstarter, so you'll be able to keep up to date with it, know more about it, and see how you can be a part of this. And did I read this properly in the press release, that if you are one of the people that are helping to fund with the Kickstarter, your name might even appear in the thanks or in the production?
Yeah. Anyone that backs over like the second or third level, their names are in the end credits. And that's become a very time consuming part of creating the end credits. Because in the earliest days, it was like 150 backers, and we're up to like 800, 900 people backing now. So yeah, there's people can have their name in the credits. There's executive producer credits too that are available. So that's a key part of the whole thing.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited to see the finished project and get out there with this. And again, let's start with this story. Set it up for us. 1924, Mount St. Helens, Washington. Which one of you would like to jump in and kind of walk us through the beginning of this story?
Eli's so excited to do it.
Well, 1924. So the story kind of begins a little bit before, like 1922. It's a group of miners. You have Marion Smith, his son, Leroy Smith, Leroy's brother-in-law, Fred Beck, and two friends of the family that were basically they wanted to go look for gold. And so they heard that Mount St. Helens was a good place to go do it. So they ended up setting up their mining claim there at Ape Canyon, towards the top of Ape Canyon. And it was 1923 that they decided maybe we should build a cabin here, because it's tough work and they wanted a place to sleep inside, not necessarily outdoors. And so they had just kind of completed the 1924 cabin when all these strange things start happening. They start hearing whistles in the woods.
Well, let me, just for clarification. So 1923 is when they really kind of start going there and working on the mining element. Was it known as Ape Canyon at that point, or does the Ape Canyon come after this series of strange phenomena?
That's a great question. I don't know if we know. Because I think the earliest reference to it on paper that has been found to it being called Ape Canyon was in the 1950s, National Forest Service. I'm not sure if it was known as Ape Canyon prior to these events.
It's pretty interesting that the National Forest Service even referred to it as Ape Canyon, because when you think of the Pacific Northwest and Washington State, apes are not the first thing that come to mind, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's Ape Cave too there.
Yeah.
Wow. There's an Ape Cave, and then there's Ape Canyon. So there's a lot of references. There's if I'm not mistaken, there's references to devils in that area too.
Yeah, the mountain devils, because that's what they originally called them. They called them mountain devils before, the term Sasquatch or Bigfoot wasn't around yet. So it was, when Fred Beck came out with his book in the 1960s, it was I Fought the Ape Men. But, the original headlines from 1924 were, they fought the mountain devils and whatnot. So.
All right. So they've set themselves up. They've got a cabin, a place to call home while they're doing this hard work, a place to keep the rain and the elements off of them. And you said soon after they start this, the phenomena began. So do you think it had more to do with the fact that they not only were they encroaching in the area, but now they were trying to settle in this area as well?
Could have been. They definitely were doing a lot of stuff. So Ape Canyon's very, very steep. It's almost a box canyon. And so in order to build the cabin, they had to blow a shelf in the side of the mountain with dynamite. And they were definitely using dynamite to excavate the mine that they were working on. So there's lots of explosions. To build the cabin, they were cutting down these large Douglas firs. So they're definitely felling trees. And so it's around that time they start hearing, whistles in the woods. They start finding footprints and seeing these creatures.
When they first begin to see these creatures, are they thinking these are just, other miners? Are they Native Americans? Did they ever kind of display what they believed they were encountering?
Yeah, by all accounts, it was that they were mountain devils, and they knew something weird was going on. Because the footprints they were finding were larger than human footprints. And basically, I think there was 2 or 3 instances before the attack on the cabin where they saw these things and shot at them. So they definitely didn't think that these were people.
Well, and there's the sort of what they think is the inciting incident. Again, Eli can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the common retelling of it. The inciting incident they think was the shooting and potentially killing of one of them. If I'm not mistaken, it goes over the side of the cliff, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they had shot at one, I think, once before that, and then that happened on July 10th, 1924. In the morning, I believe, when they shot at one, and it either fell or it kind of backed away into the canyon. They didn't see it topple over into the canyon, but it had looked like from their perspective that they shot it and it fell into the canyon. They're unsure. But then they were like, okay, this is getting too close to home. Let's pack up our stuff and get ready to go.
Would there be anything disturbed when they would return from their work, when they were mining? Would they come back and find their cabin tossed or anything like that? Or was it only when they were there at night that they would start having the strange encounters?
I don't think they had anything going on with their stuff. The cabin is literally on top of the mine, so it was very, very close. And like I said, that encounter where they shot one and it fell into the canyon happened in broad daylight. So that's another very interesting element to it all. So it was kind of happening ongoing. And so that's to say, so that happened the morning of July 10th. That night of July 10th is when the attack on the cabin happened. And so it's very possible that they did indeed shoot and kill one of these things. And then that sparked the full-blown outrage of the group.
Seth, I mean, you hear stories like this, and I've gone over some old articles of people that have encountered everything from the woolly booger to the wild man of this mountain, or the mountain devil of this place. And a lot of them do end up taking shots at these creatures. It's no wonder that they are so good at evading us now, right? I mean, for crying out loud, it seems like any time that they were, contacted or tried to come into contact with us early on, it was always met with a lot of violence.
Well, yeah, I mean, even the late 1800s, early 1900s wild man reports, so many of those stories revolve around someone shooting, potentially killing, maybe killing. Where's the body? Who knows? But those are like, that is a very common thread throughout early Sasquatch lore. I live in Massillon, Ohio, and when I moved in here, the first thing I thought of was the fact that there's a story from like 1910, 1911, something like that, about a wild man being shot and killed right outside of this part of Ohio. So it's a really common thread. And even, it goes, that shooting and potentially wounding or killing Sasquatch thing comes up to present day. I mean, you had the Justin Smeha incident, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whenever that was. There's incidents with the NAWAC, the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, potentially shooting and wounding a Sasquatch in Area X down in Oklahoma, which is an area I've been to. So it's a common thread. It's just, it always seems like it ends with nothing, no evidence. And I don't, that part of it, like so much of Sasquatchery, just leaves you scratching your head, because how did these things manage to just evade us even when they're dead?
I often wondered if some of these tales, especially when they had to shoot at them and, I killed him and it fell off the mountain ridge into the water, so we'll never find the body. If it had more to do with people trying to encroach on their mine, encroach in their area, not the Sasquatch, but the people. Mm-hmm. And is it easier to blame it on a monster and take a shot at the monster and maybe for their own mentality that they didn't just kill a human being, blame it on that, or to keep the police and law enforcement off their back by stating that they were being harassed by a creature? And I know that what you do, we have to have a belief and an interest and desire to find the truth, but we also have to have a healthy skepticism to a lot of the stories that are put out there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, on that? So many of those early reports are like the wild man stuff I talked about. So many of those reports are murder. like literally, if you just keep reading down the line, search, keywords, whatever in archives, you'll find stories that follow that up where someone murdered someone and they claimed it was a wild man. There's also the fact that in that period of time, so many of those stories, when they're talking about a wild man, they're not talking about a Sasquatch. They're talking about a homeless person or someone who's like a hermit who's living in the wild. So that happens a lot. So definitely any historical report has to be taken with a lot of skepticism, mostly because now this isn't necessarily the case with Beck, but some of those stories we never even have, we have no record whatsoever of what the actual witnesses had to say. Beck is different. This story is different, but so many of those early ones have to be taken with a massive heaping of salt because of the fact that we never hear anything directly from anybody.
Eli, when you're putting together a story like this and looking, especially when a story that's over 100 years old, how hard is it to get factual information? We do know that back then it wasn't clean-cut science reporting that was taking place in the newspapers. They were selling salacious headlines, even in the most prestigious of newspapers. Whatever sold, right? Whatever kind of weird stories would come out, they would put these things out, almost like an original weekly news world or weekly world news kind of thing. If they came out, they just reported on them and sometimes had a little bit of a P.T. Barnum spin on them.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple factors here. So one, you have the star of the film, Mark Marcel, who has kind of spearheaded the historical research for the past pretty much 20 years. And the amount of information he's uncovered, from their mining claim, from discovering the cabin site to discovering the mine, and even, newspapers that aren't readily available, that aren't even online, and even finding this cache of photographs that had never seen the light of day before last year. I mean, he discovered them last year, and so that even 100 years, there's still more. Where it was a photo set of Leroy, Smith, and Fred Beck, and they returned to the cabin the next week with the press, and they took photographs of the tracks on the ground. They casted one of the tracks. They took photos of the cabin site. So it's like those kinds of things. But then also, too, like you were saying, the headlines for about a week were very, there's rumors of a gorilla hunt. Miners got into a fight with gorillas. But then, very quickly it was, these miners were interested in spiritualism, so they conjured up something. Or you have the story of the YMCA boys. The YMCA boys claimed that they had hiked out to the cabin after lights out and were the ones throwing the rocks. But, I think the biggest combating of that particular story is if the miners had been shooting at, children, YMCA boys, then that would have been the story rather than it coming out a week later. Right.
Right. And of course, there's always the spin put on things by the locals, right? We don't want to scare people away from this area. We want to do this. So let's just blame it on kids trying to, prank or hoax and scare somebody. Let's take a quick break. But when we come back, I would like to touch on that. Obviously, at first it was just the sounds of whistles, wood knocks, other noises that these creatures would create. But it wasn't until they took a shot that things started to amp up. I'm curious as to if you know why they decided to take a shot, and let's go to that night for that attack and talk a little bit more in depth about what took place. We'll cover that right here when we return to the very best in paranormal programming. I'm Dave Schrader, and this is the Paranormal 60. A new year is here, and with Valentine's Day just around the corner, it's the perfect time to look ahead. Whether you're thinking about love, a new career path, a move, or even an investment, wouldn't it be amazing to know what messages the universe or the other side have in store for you? Well, that's where Love and Lotus Tarot with Winnie Schrader comes in. Winnie's intuitive readings can help you gain the clarity and guidance you need to carve out a new path. Life is hard enough, my friends. Why not let the cards light the way? Readings are available by phone or live video stream, so you can connect with Winnie wherever you are. And right now, we've got a deal just for you. All readings just 20% off. Use code LOVELOTUS2030 for a 30-minute session. Use code LOVELOTUS2060 for a 60-minute session, and you will save 20% off. Use the code words at checkout to receive that discount. You can book between now and March 1st, 2025 to get the special discount. Don't wait. Visit paranormal60.com. Click on the Love and Lotus tab to book your session today. Discover what the cards have to say and step into your best year yet with Love and Lotus Tarot with Winnie Schrader. Welcome back to the program. Joining us, we have director Eli Watson, executive producer Seth Breedlove. The new film, the Siege of Ape Canyon documentary film that will be out later this year. You can find more information about that on the links that we've incorporated on today's program guide. And you can find ways to become part of the Kickstarter program as well. So check that out. All right, guys, before the break, I was mentioning I'd like to kind of discuss how does it go from this just kind of basic animal noises and things around to we're going to take a shot at these.
I think the answer is a pretty basic one. Because we're not, besides Fred Beck's book and then also the initial articles, we don't get a whole lot of insight into what these guys were exactly thinking. But I think, just based on everything we know about Sasquatch is that here's this big hairy thing and it's kind of freaking me out. And 1924, very different times was today. So it's like, let's shoot first, ask questions later type situation.
Oh, humans, we're a wonderful breed, aren't we?
Yeah.
So they take a shot. They believe they may have killed it or severely wounded it.
Yeah.
And then all hell breaks loose. Walk me through what that day and night was like for the miners.
Well, they returned back to camp. Leroy and Fred, who had shot at this thing, returned back to camp, and they were like, okay, this is what the situation is. We've seen these things a couple of times. We just shot one. This is way too much for us. So we need to pack up our stuff and leave the mountain tomorrow. And
now that says something, right? I mean, you're gold miners. You're up there trying to hit a strike to make your money, to make your fortunes. You've got an area that's known to be rich in this kind of precious metals. To be freaked out enough to say, nope, let's go. That really says something about them as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's and these are very hardcore men. I mean, Marion Smith, the kind of leader of the group, he was in his 60s when he went up there to even begin looking for gold. And, he's out there felling trees and blowing up the side of the mountain with dynamite. I mean, these are gruff men. So something like this to scare them off is pretty significant, I would say.
I'm sorry, Dave, for accosting your show here, but had they actually, how much had they brought back? And like, did they find gold? How much had they found? Do you know?
Just a little bit. Okay. There is stories that from Leroy's daughter, who's actually interviewed in the film, of a little bit, a pouch filled with gold in one of his dressers, but they didn't know where it had come from. And they didn't want to ask, hey, Dad, I was looking through your stuff and found this pouch of gold, So I know they had found some, but I don't know exactly how much.
So that major strike wasn't happening anyway. It was probably a lot easier than to leave a site like this when you're not hitting what you're hoping for.
Probably, yeah.
All right. And they go back to the cabin. How quickly does this thing go from just noises to full-on altercation and rock throwing and banging on the walls?
Well, as soon as it got dark is basically when they heard something hit the side of the cabin, and that was a rock being thrown. And then there's, if you picture it on a slope, these creatures are above the slope at first, throwing rocks down onto the roof of the cabin. They come down, they crawl on top of the cabin. They're trying to rip the chinking open to crawl inside. They're trying to actually dig underneath the cabin and get in that way. They're banging on the door. They're reaching through the siding. They're breaking through the window. And, all these guys, it's 5 dudes, and they're all armed. They're all shooting at these things. At one point, I think there's an axe that was grabbed. One of these creatures had reached in through the side and grabbed one of their axes and was trying to pull it out. And so they were kind of playing tug of war with it.
It's not a very big cabin either, right? Like I don't know if we have dimensions or anything, but it's not, when you hear cabin, it's not like an Airbnb.
No, this was like a 20 by 20 cabin, so it was basically enough for them to sleep in, because they didn't stay up there year round. They only stayed up there for the summer, because by the winter, everything's so covered in snow, you're not going to be doing much work anyways. So they just built enough for them to sleep in. And so, yeah, and the attack continued pretty much all night long.
And they're exchanging fire with these creatures, because part of it is you sit back and you think, well, geez, they're huge. They're big creatures, right? That we've seen what we believe to be evidence of them reaching up and pulling down trees and snapping them over. Getting into a cabin that was built in 1924 seems like it would have been a pretty easy get for them. And especially if they've got their arms in the windows, but it wasn't like they were just fighting off the Golden Girls with rolling pins and a skillet, right? I mean, they were getting shot at the whole time, so that probably explains a lot of why they weren't getting in and not making good on their threats to try to pay these people back for what had happened to their fellow tribe member.
Right.
the story as it goes, you've got these kind of attacks going. It lasts all night. Do they ever talk about what it was like then in the morning to just decide, we got to leave? I would be terrified to leave that spot, because now you're really entering their realm. And if they're that adept at being around, you don't have the ceilings and walls to protect you. If they're standing up and they have the Obi-Wan Kenobi high ground and can nail you with a rock from a pretty good distance, you become a much easier target out there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Again, we're very limited on the internal thoughts of a lot of these guys. And I think part of that is, different time, something like that happens. People think they're crazy, so they don't want to discuss it, really, When Fred Beck published his book, which was 1966, I believe, the tides had turned and it was becoming a little bit more acceptable to talk about these things. And so, but you're right, they opened up the cabin door, it sounded like they had gone away. It's first light. They're seeing all the tracks around their cabin. They're seeing all the rocks that are about softball sized. And they're like, we need to get out of here. And that trek back, they had a car stashed at Spirit Lake, which was 6 miles away. So I'm sure that was a little bit tense, that jaunt back to Spirit Lake.
I mean, one thing worth mentioning too is Eli has been to the cabin site. So like when you say Spirit Lake 6 miles away, I'm assuming that's like is that a 1 day hike or 2 day? I mean, how long is 6 miles through that wilderness?
That's probably a good half day hike. So, they're packing.
Yeah, because that terrain is uneven, wooded, thick, heavy, right? I mean, especially coming in and out of a canyon like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think the first part would have been them getting out of the actual canyon, which they're about 1,000 feet down, and they had set up ladders and stuff like that. So getting out probably wouldn't have been too difficult. But up on top, like you said, it is uneven. At the time, it would have been completely forested. Now it's not, because of the 1980 eruption. It's all completely leveled. But back then, it would have been completely forested. So, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm sure it was very tense.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the Mount St. Helens eruption as well, because there have been a lot of legend and lore that after the eruption, there were people, firefighters and forestry workers that were reported to have helped some of these Sasquatch that were injured from that time. Do you put any stock into those claims as well?
Well, the history, like I said, the history specifically in Mount St. Helens and like Cougar, Washington, and that entire area is as tied to Sasquatch history as like Bluff Creek. Like Robert W. Morgan was stationed at Mount St. Helens for like years conducting research. Like my issue with those stories has always been that we have just stories through the internet. It's almost like a creepypasta, and it's taken on such a life of its own, where we just constantly hear these tales about helicopters ferrying bodies away and people seeing Sasquatch bodies taken off the mountain, following the eruption. But there's no evidence for any of it. It's almost the opposite of the Ape Canyon incident, because Ape Canyon, technically, you would think we wouldn't have any documentation from this. We wouldn't have anything bolstering the veracity of it, but
right.
We do. We have a lot. We have Beck's book. We have all the work Mark Marcel's done to turn up, evidence that this happened. But then you have these vague stories about, firemen ferrying Sasquatch bodies off. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but why haven't
you heard it here, folks? You heard it here first. Seth Breedlove calls shenanigans on all of the firefighters.
The boycott begins tomorrow.
Yeah. Hashtag believe the firefighters.
I'm in agreement with Seth on that, actually. So I did one of my episodes of the series for Road to Discovery actually talks about those claims in particular. And I interviewed this guy who's kind of a historian about the whole eruption. And the situation was that, it would take you several hours to traverse 1 mile with all the tree fall, all the, animal carcasses and things like that. And so you have this one story from the eruption that they were helping this one find the others, and they were driving around the destruction zone. It's like, if you see the pictures and if you were there, you would know driving around the destruction zone just wasn't possible.
Yeah. It's crazy too, because when you think of the historical significance of something like Sasquatch bodies being ferried off the mountain during the eruption versus just some no-name miners, up there. But we do, like I said, we know who Fred Beck was. We know who the other miner, we know who these men were. We have evidence. We have photos. We have all that stuff. At the end of the day, are we ever going to 100% conclusively know they were attacked by Bigfoot? No, just like we don't 100% know that was an actual Sasquatch in the Patterson-Gimlin film. There's just a ton of conjecture on what is happening with these famous Sasquatch cases. It's one of the reasons why it's also fascinating. It's why it's become such a popular topic.
Now, you've actually uncovered, right? I mean, the cabin or the remains of the cabin still exist?
Yes. So at this point in time, So July 11th, after they came down after the attack, they actually closed their mining claim, and Mark has that documented, that documentation. So, and besides that photo shoot where Leroy and Fred Beck returned with the press, they never went back up to that spot. And so the cabin, after years and years and years, has just completely fallen apart, and all that's left now is just the foundation.
Interesting. Yeah, I was wondering if there was anything else left to it because, in the case of like the Lizzie Borden house, I know back in the day when I believe it was Ghost Adventures or Ghost Hunters were going there, I was talking to them. I always said, it'd be interesting to use luminol in the basement and spray under the area where Mr. Borden had been murdered, because I've got to guess that wood must have soaked in some of that blood. And sure enough, they did do luminol and found that. I just didn't know if there was anything left of this cabin that could allow us to spray luminol and see if there's any blood remnants or anything there that would maybe even give us a DNA possible sample that we could work with.
Maybe. It's also been 100 years and in the weather the entire time, so I would assume any organic material like that would be long gone. The cabin site itself is fairly unimpressive. I remember I knew that the only thing left was the foundation. And I remember when I got there with Mark and Tyler, and I sat down and I was like, okay, so where's this cabin? And Mark was like, you're sitting on it. And what I had thought was a log was actually the foundation of the cabin. And that was, so, I mean, there's really not much to it left anymore.
Are there still reports of activity in and around that area? And while you were there, did you witness or hear anything strange?
Yeah, well, yes, to both of those. So my good friend Chris Spencer and his now wife Rebecca Slick have done research on the other side of Mount St. Helens. I want to say the north side of Mount St. Helens, and they've collected audio tracks and potentially even got one on video there. So there's definitely, and that was 5 years ago. So, I mean, there's stuff happening there for sure.
What took place when you visited? Did you hear anything, see anything? Or is that something you want to keep for the documentary?
No, I'll share it right here.
Okay.
So getting up to the actual Ape Canyon is kind of a jaunt. So you have the Ape Canyon trailhead, and then it takes you 6 miles up the mountain before you get to the top of Ape Canyon. And so because it's such a long hike, we're taking a couple of days to film there. So we spent 3 days, 3 nights there, and I brought my camping supplies, my camera gear, my food. I'm carrying like a 60-pound pack up the mountain, and I'm like, I'm not going to bring a tent because I don't want. It's the middle of July. It's not going to rain.
Right.
And so, as I said, the whole area now on top of the canyon itself was actually sheltered from the blast because of the buttes there. So the cabin site and everything is still forested. It's never been logged. So it's pretty much the exact same as it was back in the day. But above where we were camped is covered in this fine layer of ash. And I thought that was kind of cool at first until the third day when the wind picked up and was blowing ash in my face. And I woke up that third morning, it just completely covered in ash. And we had one more night to go. And the wind did not die down. It got worse. And so Mark Marcel's neighbor went up there with us. His name's Brad. And he kind of set up this tarp for me. It was a 5x5 tarp. He set it up as kind of a windbreak, real low to the ground, you know. And so I kind of crawled in there and went to sleep about 11 p.m. And I remember waking up some short time after and being completely twisted around in my sleeping bag. My sleeping pad was deflated and I was just freezing cold. It was great. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's like 5 a.m. and I can just tough it out. And so I checked my phone and it was midnight. And I was like, so I've been asleep for an hour. It was the second time my sleeping pad had deflated, so I knew there was a hole in it. And so I don't use inflatable sleeping pads anymore because I don't want to deal with that. Anyways, so I was like, well, I'm not going to get up. And so I was just laying there kind of trying to force the sleeping bag back to normal. Finally did it and was just I stopped moving, and about 30 seconds after that, something grabbed my foot. And it felt like a hand, and Brad had been playing jokes on us the whole time. And so I was like, this is Brad. I'm not in a good mood right now, so I'm not going to give him the response he wants. So I just laid there and let him hold on to my foot. And then it just like kept going. And I was like, okay, this is getting weird. So I pulled my feet underneath the tarp and I laid there silently waiting for like Brad to laugh or like him to say, go back to sleep, Eli. And there was just nothing. And then I heard this thing walk across to the left, and then it went behind the tarp and it stopped. And Brad was camped off to my right. And at that moment when it stopped, I heard Brad clear his throat off to my right. So I was like, that's Brad to my right. So whatever this is isn't Brad. And Brad had these kind of mountain house meals that he had been eating, and he had put his trash inside one and closed it up and put it up in this tree that happened to be behind the tarp. And this thing started like crinkling the bag, and it didn't open it. It was just like crinkling it like you would like a bag of chips or something. And that's when it like really hit me, and my heart was really pounding, and I was really scared. And I thought about looking because, you know, I'm under a tarp. All I had to do was push up and look, and I couldn't bring myself to move. And then after a minute or two, I heard this thing turn off and walk back to the right, which was towards the mountain where there's nothing. And I like went back to sleep, but in the morning, the mountain house meal was still up in the tree. Like I said, the wind was blowing, so there was no tracks or anything. And I talked to Brad. I said, was that you? And he was like, no, I was asleep. And I talked to Mark, and Mark was like, no, I was asleep. And everyone was asleep. And I was just like, I don't know what just happened. And I'm running through all the possibilities. I was like, well, if it was a bear, it would have torn through the bag. There's no way it could have grabbed both sides of my foot, you know, because it, like I said, it felt like a hand. It like grabbed it like that, you know. And then I'm like, well, maybe it was another camper, even though there was no other campers up there. And then I'm like, well, that wouldn't even make sense. If someone was sneaking into our camp, they wouldn't grab someone's foot, you know. And so I'm like, I don't know what that was. And
well, it's simple, Eli. It was a Littlefoot hunter. The Sasquatch don't believe in you either, so they're out there, and the guy, he probably grabbed your foot, took a photo with his flip phone, and that is crazy though. And just listeners, do me a favor, don't send me emails going, what kind of guy goes out looking for Bigfoot and then won't actually look outside the tarp? Because I can tell you, having been in some of the most haunted and strange places, you believe you are ready for the moment until it happens. And when the realization that something this big, this momentous is there, sometimes you don't have that nerve you think you did. And it's real easy sitting back in your homes where you've got the heat on and you haven't been laying on the ground in a deflated mattress and you're sleep deprived and probably food deprived, to say what you would do. But I've seen some of the biggest, strongest men in the world that I know, and women, run like 2-year-olds afraid from a spider. So you mean to tell me you might have just been grabbed by a huge bipedal ape-like creature and you just would stick your head outside of the tent? I just hold back the criticism, because the reality is so much different when you put yourself out into that. And I applaud you, Eli, because that's not me. I would go Bigfooting with you guys as long as I get driven back to the Holiday Inn that night. Listen, I'm not a fan of the outdoors during the daylight. Nighttime, I don't think so. That's not going to happen. I just think that's better left in the hands of somebody else. We do need to take one more quick break. We'll come back. I'd like to talk a little bit more about Bigfoot, and especially with I mean, in this case, we believe that the aggression began because of the shooting. But we've started to hear more and more stories over the last decade of Bigfoot becoming aggressive, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are on this. And we'll talk about that when we return right here to the Paranormal 60.
Did you know that radio just got a little extraterrestrial? That's right, Dave Schrader is back on radio with the Paranormal 360 every Sunday evening, 7 to 9 p.m. Central on WCCO AM 830, an Odyssey station. Just download the Odyssey app and look for the WCCO logo, follow the station, and listen live. That's the Paranormal 360 on WCCO AM 830, an Odyssey station.
Welcome back to the program. Again, our guests, Eli Watson, Seth Breedlove. We're talking about the new documentary film that'll be out later in 2025 called The Siege of Ape Canyon, one of the most compelling Bigfoot encounters witnessed by many people. Before the break, I talked about the fact that we know, or we believe we know, why the creatures got so aggressive in this case. But there are a lot of stories that have started popping up over the last decade regarding Bigfoot becoming more territorial or vicious. In most cases, I hear it's because somebody thinks it's cute. They start leaving food out for Bigfoot. And then when they forget one night, Bigfoot gets real angsty about it and sometimes starts getting violent. Quick thoughts on that from both of you. Seth, let's start with you.
I mean, I've been in a place where I believe there were Bigfoots a couple times now, where I've experienced activity. One place where we experienced activity for a couple months. I've never experienced that kind of like aggressive behavior.
No. Weren't they throwing rocks at you at Area X?
Not directly at us. They're just hitting buildings and stuff.
Okay.
Seth, you have a lot more tolerance than I do. I don't care if it's within 10 feet of me. If something's throwing rocks.
Well, I mean, we were there was an incident. There's been two incidences when I was in Minerva on the property down there where we shot the Bigfoot project, where I had my sighting. But we had two times where rocks impacted very close to us. One time, a rock fell within probably 5 feet of myself and one of our researchers, Heather Mosier. And then there was another incident where a rock hit I believe it hit a tree behind my buddy Mark Matsky when we were out at the same property. So, but I've always felt like the rock throwing thing is more of it's more of like they're trying to entice you to do something. They want to see how you're going to react to this stuff. I've never experienced something where I felt like my life was in danger due to Sasquatch. Those stories exist. And obviously the Ape Canyon incident is one of them, but there's others. But I've typically, when you hear those, not in the Ape Canyon story, but typically those stories are connected with a lone individual, which makes me think it's like a rogue Sasquatch that's left the family unit and is off on its own.
The John Wick of the Bigfoot.
Being crazy. Yeah, exactly. It's the Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees of Sasquatches. Those stories, the problem is that we have gotten to a point where, and I can't act like I'm blameless here, but pop culture and movies really propel the spooky stories. The fact is that the bulk of Sasquatch sightings are really mundane. You know, it's like as mundane as a story about an 8-foot tall monster in the woods can be, but most of them are about a creature crossing a road or trying to stay hidden. That is the bulk of it. So I do think those things happen. I just think they're few and far between.
Eli, what are your thoughts on the aggressive nature of some of the Bigfoot sightings that have been reported over the last decade?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because, gosh, I don't know. Seth really answered the question very well.
Would you encourage people to think that they have a Bigfoot on their property, start leaving food or items out for them?
No, I don't think that's a good idea. And also, I don't know if you can conclusively like prove that Bigfoot is taking those things, because it's like if you live out in the woods and you put an apple out on a tree stump, you know, it's like, well, there's raccoons and squirrels and anything.
Or I mean, it's like when we were in Alaska, Eli, and everyone kept telling me put peanut butter in a tree, and I put peanut butter in a tree, and within like 5 minutes of going back to my cabin, my rural cabin out at the base of Denali, I'm like, there's literally grizzly bears out here. Like there's brown bears. I mean, it's like the dumbest thing you could do in some places. You know, like I get the idea behind it, but it still is a wild thing to go stick peanut butter in a tree in a place where there's brown bears.
Well, especially without jelly, because Bigfoot, he's not an animal, for God's sake. Give him jelly.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, I'm with you on that. It's an animal. You know, I think there's two different interpretations of Bigfoot. One is that it's this big scary monster that's ready to kill you, and then the other is that it's like they're the forest people and they want to be your friend. And it's like no, it's, you know, I learned this, you know, doing the Mountains of Mystery series that I'm working on now, and talking to Kathy Strain. You know, like in the Sierra Nevadas, you have the Tule River people who basically elevate Sasquatch to the level of God. Bigfoot's the one who created us, made us bipedal. Well, you go over a couple of miles and you talk to the Miwok people, and they're these man-eating monsters, you know, and it's like, well, how can it be both? They're talking about the same thing, but it's both. And it's like, well, they're people experiencing different behaviors from the same animal and interpreting it differently mythologically. And so it's like, we have to be cognizant of the fact that this thing is an animal. If provoked, you're either entering its territory or you're shooting at it, or both. You know, it's going to act aggressively. But, you know, it's also not going to be like your best friend. It's not a dog, you know.
Here's just something that came to mind when you brought this up, and I know this might end up being a little controversial, but you talk about, you know, one sect believes this creature is a benevolent god, right? The others believe it to be something else. Well, it's not so far removed from our own theologies, right? The Old Testament of the Bible had a very mean God who did a lot of really kind of sketchy stuff. The New Testament kind of revives the story in a different light. It's kind of a different enlightenment to the way that they perceive the same kind of situations. So it's, you know, it's an interesting facet to me that one group may consider it to be this, the other may consider it to be that, but it also could be how they treat that being in their area, right? If one tribe is more aggressive and trying to throw rocks and keep them away, while the other is leaving tokens out for them or tributes, could that be why they're getting a better, or feel that it's a more benevolent response?
Well, okay, so this is a good segue into something that I wanted to talk about, because no one talks about it, and I think it's weird, and that is the fact that Eli's going to have to expand on this, but I only know about it from what I've talked about to Mark Marcel about it, which is the fact that there was occult activity taking place at the cabin with the miners. Basically, am I wrong in saying like a Ouija boards and stuff? What were they? What's the full story here?
I'm not sure about at the cabin site itself, but we know for sure.
You're ruining this already. We gotta really ramp it up.
No, but Fred Beck was like conducting seances and stuff, definitely after the fact, for sure. You know, like one of the things that came out, the miners were involved with spiritualism. which they adamantly denied. And then like 10 years later, Fred Beck is conducting seances in his living room. So it's like, I'm pretty sure you don't just get into that, you know, after being falsely accused of it. So there's some element of that. And, you know, Fred Beck's book definitely includes lots of strange things. Like the reason why they chose the site for their mine was they came across like this Native American man who said, I know why you're here. If you look up in the sky tomorrow, you'll see an arrow in the sky pointing you to where you need to go. And apparently they followed that and found the mine site. And it's like that, again, you know, because none of the other miners really talked about it. That is the only reason we have of why they chose the top of Ape Canyon for their mine site. So it's like, I don't know. It's really bizarre.
Yeah, there's and just swinging back real quick to like the perception thing. There's also the fact that depending on where you go in the United States, the various tribes have just ascribed various attributes to Bigfoot. So like here in Ohio, we have like Stonish giants and all these legends, you know, these native legends. But the behavior never aligns necessarily across like okay, so in Ohio it's there's a war between these beings, you know, these Stonish giants beings, and they'll kill people. And then down in like North Carolina, where my family's from, over by Cherokee, they're talking about how these beings walk between worlds, and they're basically like an energy force, you know, and they're there for good and to protect the environment around them. It could be as simple as what you said earlier. Like it could literally be that maybe one tribe is more fearful, just naturally fearful than the other, and so the other ascribes a completely different attribute. It's also possible that they're running into creatures that just behaviorally act completely different from one family group to the next. That's something I've thought about too.
Yeah, we do know there are different types of people in the world, and there are more aggressive and more docile people. So it's not so far removed to believe that there might be different approaches of these creatures as well, and what their encounters were like. Mm-hmm. Maybe the ones that are set deeper into the woods that aren't always encroached upon might be a little bit more docile, as opposed to the ones that feel like we're constantly invading their space. Mm-hmm. Mm. Fun stuff. I'm super excited about this for you guys. I hope this takes off really well. I know the documentary will be out a little bit later on in 2025. The Siege of Ape Canyon, Small Town Monsters. Check out their website. We have a link for that on today's program guide. And you can also find the link for the Kickstarter program, so you can be a part of that with Seth and Eli and the great team over at Small Town Monsters. Gentlemen, before we say goodbye, is there anything else you'd like to leave the audience with, considering these the documentary and all the other work that you're doing?
I mean, we make feature films. We also make YouTube content, episodic content that goes up on Tubi and all that kind of stuff too. So if people like Small Town Monsters and the work we do, they can watch our work on YouTube. I do 3 different YouTube shows myself: Buckeye Bigfoot, Bigfoot Decoded, and the Bigfoot Archives. And then Eli's doing Bigfoot Mountains of Mystery.
Yes.
And but you can, like, we have over 200 hours worth of episodic content on the YouTube channel you can go check out. So there's other series that we've both done, that Eli and I have both done.
Very cool. Yeah. Well, we will, and you can find that from the link as well at Small Town Monsters, correct?
Yep.
All right. And Eli?
I mean, if you like what we do, consider backing the Kickstarter, because that makes it all possible for us to do what we do.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to hang in after the program. I'll come back and I have some information I'll share with you as well. And we'll talk about it then. So thank you very much to Seth Breedlove, to Eli Watson for joining us this evening and sharing some information about the new documentary. The Legend of Ape Canyon has stood the test of time. It's an eerie tale of survival, fear, and the unknown. Were those miners truly under siege by something not of this world, or has the story just grown taller with each retelling? One thing is certain, the wilderness still holds its secrets. A big thank you to the executive producer, Seth Breedlove, and director Eli Watson for taking us deeper into the Siege of Ape Canyon. Stay curious, my friends. Stay skeptical and keep your eyes on the shadows, because you never know what's watching you. And may the darkness of this world be just a little bit brighter with the information that we share here. Until next time, I'm Dave Schrader, and this has been My Paranormal 60.